listening to ProveText, a Glossa House podcast by Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, Dr. Fredrick J. Long, Dr. Mario Melendez, Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and J. M. Smith. Welcome and enjoy.
Is the plural versus singular significant in terms of, do you have any reference to Romans in general as wolves that could also play a part? And then I guess kind of related to that is the question, is it Roma or Rome or a combination of the two with the singular?
Yeah, on the last one, I'm not sure on that. I'm not really sure. But on the first question that you had about the singular wolf, I think again there's so many options that you could have used with the plural there of scattering. And I think it's interesting also that the wolf does not devour them, only scatters them. And I think there could be, and farther in the paper and more research, this is exactly what happened after 70. We had this scattering. And I wonder if there isn't kind of a historical allusion there to this wolf of Rome doing the scattering. I also think there might be another reference in the Johannine to the phrase, the ruler of this world. That seems to be a recurring phrase in the Johannine. And so often people go back, well, that's the devil. It seems like that's a pretty good answer that people give all the time if they're not quite sure of what the image is. Well, that's the devil. But the ruler of this world, I think, goes back again to the image of the wolf, the image of Rome. It's Rome that is ruler of the world. Set in contrast to what Jesus is doing, the noble shepherd. Yeah.
We'll have to move on, but I'm sure David will get to speak afterwards.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, John, David, please present. Our next presenter is Fredrick Long from Asbury Theological Seminary, and the title of his paper is Roman Imperial Analogues and Reference in 2 Corinthians, Realia and Numismatic Evidence.
Well, thank you for allowing me to present my research here. David, I do argue that about the ruler of this world and age in John. It's kind of a side comment, but a lot of my research has investigated these weird references to entities that we often just think are Satan. And we're going to see one of them, maybe 2 or 3 of them today in 2 Corinthians. After finishing my dissertation, the final edits published in Cambridge, I had the very sad feeling that I had left a lot of 2 Corinthians unexplored, which is kind of weird when you spend 5 years of your life on something. And I argued for the rhetorical unity of 2 Corinthians. I still stand by that. And my research has only confirmed its rhetorical unity and argumentative unity. And so here is just a little description of how I understand the structure. And really the core of Paul's argument as he really gets going before he does a hard pivot in 10 to refute his opponents and criticisms is focused on developing this triumphal metaphor, and we're going to look at that extensively. So part of the context of my research here, the subsequent research, is this observation by Charles William made to Ross Sanders that Paul's greatest enemy in Corinth was the imperial cult. And this is quite an amazing statement to make. Indeed, of Paul's letters, 2 Corinthians is the least explored in regard to imperial criticism, I would say. And so let's look at this a little bit. I'm going to first look at the Roman Corinth's context and its devotion to the imperial cult and rulers and family. I'm going to be looking at different places where I see analogs to this imperial realia, God's Son, God's triumph, and God's image, Jesus as God's image, and the gospel proclaimed of Jesus Lord. And then I'm going to move to passages that I believe have reference to imperial figures and identities. The God of this age, Belial, and Satan disguised as an angel of light. So quick, and I may need to move very quickly. I've got 50-some slides, so bear with me. I'm going to go quickly. So there's this history. Corinth was refounded by Julius Caesar, and the coinage reflects this intimate, ongoing commitment and interest in the family. And I think we're going to have a paper following mine that may look and show that. And so here's just some examples of that. And this is continuous. So Caligula, Claudius, and then Nero. Here are some coins from Corinth that show that, including a Tiberius laureate coin, the radiate head of Augustus coin, Livia, and a female who's veiled, perhaps Livia as a priestess. We have temples, and we're not even sure exactly which temples he's referred to, but there is several temples that we'll look at. Here's a coin showing Claudius laureate and a temple on the Acra Corinth. Now, there are several temple sites. There's a temple to the gens Julia, and we're going to look at an article, essay by Mary Wallbank, where she is trying to figure out where is this temple, but we know that it was there. There's other temples there you can see. This is an image from her essay in which she kind of lays out that cityscape. We're going to come back to this Augustalis base, which is in the forum there. At least 3 of the deceased members of the family, imperial family, held established cults there, Julius, Augustus, and Livia. And the most prominent statue was that of the deified Augustus. Here on this Augustalis base, it says, "To the god Augustus," 8-foot-tall, Jupiter-like statue of Augustus. Then we also had the establishment of the provincial imperial cult in Achaia, occurred at 54, at Nero's ascension to the throne. We have at least 4 cult groups committed to honoring the imperial family and participating in the imperial cult at the time of Paul's proclamation of the gospel. So we have these different groups. The ones who erected the statue of Augustus are the Augustales, made up of freedmen and freeborn. And finally, there were a lot of games, ludi, spectacles and gladiatorial contests, Isthmian games, circuses, the Caesarea games, which then merged with the Caesarea games held in 51. I think it's likely that Paul was there and saw that. So there's more history to these games. And then there was another game, probably 55 CE. And at such games and circuses, patrons would likely have the honor of entering dressed in triumphal garb, in imitation of the practice of Rome. Now, when we take the chronology, some basic chronology, merging that with Paul's third missionary journey, we see that there's a significant overlap, including Nero becoming emperor and the provincial imperial cult coming to Achaia. And he's writing 2 Corinthians, I would argue, sometime in this time period, maybe at that time, near that time, Nero celebrates an Novatio, which is a triumph from a peaceful surrender. So 2 Corinthians is a rhetorical defense as well as a countercharge. Paul says, you've been thinking all along that we've been defending ourselves to you. And while he says this, he also countercharges the Corinthians with different vices. And he asks, have you been approved? I'm approved. And did you pass the test? I passed the test. So this is how he ends the discourse. But prior to this, Paul's countercharge really comes to a climactic moment with his appeal not to be yoked together with unbelievers. And then has these series of 5 contrasts: lawlessness, darkness, Belial contrasted with Christ, unbelievers with believers, and then culminating with the temple of God. What does the temple of God have in common with idols? Now, surrounding this controversial passage are these statements: "You also widen out," and "make room for us." These are indeed processional shouting. As a parade was going through, you had heralds shouting, "Open up and make room for us." So this takes us to, and this will take us, the triumphal parading metaphor, which he begins in 2:14 in earnest, is related to this, and we'll talk about that just briefly, shortly later. Now, Paul frames his letter by reference to the most honorable line of defense, which is a qualitative defense, stressing his intentions. "I intended to come to you," and he stresses this. And eventually he pops out, and his defense then is linked to God's faithfulness. My word is faithful, God is faithful, and particularly what is God's word and what does it consist? It consists of the proclamation of Jesus is Lord. And that is going to eventually lead to the affirmation that God leads in triumphal procession everywhere, every place. A wonderful book that explores this is Christoph Hellig's Paul's Triumph. And he concludes that Paul's use of triumph imagery demonstrates that he was actively observing and engaging with his Roman environment. Paul is infiltrating the Roman sphere itself by consciously subverting the idea of Roman superiority. In the end, Paul is confronting Roman power exactly by pointing to God's power. And then he also correctly notes that this metaphor serves an apologetic purpose. God causes the movement of Paul and his colleagues. So at issue was Paul's saying he would visit the Corinthians at a certain time. He failed to visit. Why did he fail to visit? Paul can say it's God's fault. and he's leading me around. And so let's look at these texts. So after 2:18, my word is faithful, just as God's word is faithful, he says, the Son of God is proclaimed among you. Jesus Christ, the one proclaimed. Now, this title, the Son of God, only occurs 4 times in the Pauline letters. Galatians 2:20, which is part of the thesis statement there. Romans 1:4, who Jacob Taubner in his book, The Political Theology of Rome, Romans says this amounts to a declaration of war against Rome. The statement there in Romans 1:4. In Ephesians 4:13, there's 3 different political titles that are piled together there: Son of God, the perfect man, Christ. And this is a climactic moment in the discourse. Now, what's unique about 2 Corinthians 1:19 is the genitive fronting, tu theou huios, which is not in the case with the other reference. This is a calque, I believe, for the Latin divi filius, the Son of God. So when the emperor who's coming to the throne was adopted as the son, and then the previous deceased emperor was divinized, the new emperor could be called the divi filius, the Son of God. And on coins, we're going to see that the divi is always fronted, and it's never abbreviated, whereas the filius, it could be abbreviated. Interesting, too, in LSJ, the passive use of kerusso, which we have here, is proclaimed, Jesus Christ is proclaimed, was used of emperors, or conquerors, I should say. So there's already imperial encoding in what Paul says in 1:19. So here's some coins that show the use of divi filius. Again, the divi is never abbreviated. And just that this title is ubiquitous and comes over into Greek with theou, huios. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time. I think this is very well established how common these coins are and in circulation. This is possibly one of the denarii that could have been in mind as we had the wonderful talk earlier. So this triumph then picks up after Paul deals with some issues of discipline within the community, the need to forgive this person. In 12:14, there's a pivot. Paul is looking for Titus, and he's looking for relief. And Titus is this link between him and the Corinthians. And then Paul says, "Thanks be to God, the one who always and everywhere leads us in triumph in Christ." This triumphal theme has been explored by David Aus. He identifies 10 technical themes of triumph. I've been particularly influenced by the work of Paul Duff, who sees the triumphal imagery as really part of an epiphany processional theme. It's one type of epiphany parade. And my research, I've identified nearly 40 of these themes in these verses. And this is where I think it's really fascinating. In chapter 6, Paul is going to be saying, "You Corinthians," he calls them out by their identificator civic name. He says, "You are the temple of God." And the triumphal procession, as you may know, started outside the city and ended in front of the Capitolinus temple. And so there's an analog even in this parading motif, which starts in 2:14 and ends in this climactic affirmation that you are the temple of the living God. And whenever Paul says living God, it means not a pagan dead God. There's a monograph that explores that. Paul, the apostle of the living God. So there's a lot of processional imagery going on. There's a history of emperors coming to throne and celebrating triumphs. And this is one way that this is done is with the quadriga, with the elephants pulling it, which is a sign, obviously, of power, but also of divination. And so here we have Julius Radiate riding the quadriga. And this occurs with Claudius, with Augustus divinized. And there in the background is the Jupiter Capitolina temple. So there's this association with the triumph and the temple. With Nero, when he celebrated his Ovatio, he also minted coins, Arius coins. And here, riding the chariot with the elephants, are Claudius and Augustus, and both of them are radiate. This radiate is significant because it's merging solar divinization themes, monarchy themes, with the emperor, such that the son of the emperor, the adoptive son, becomes the son of a god. So here's a closer up picture of that radiate head. Now, a second place of reference, or a third, this is the third, is in 4:3-5. The triumphal theme is picked up here in a couple ways. I forgot to mention, having received mercy. This is something that happened with the triumphal parades. And also there is those who are perishing. This phrase in 4:3 picks up the people in 2:14 and 15. One group of people who are perishing. Some are being saved, some are being perishing. And the god of this world is, in this case, has blinded their eyes, the minds, from seeing the light of the gospel, the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. We do not proclaim ourselves. There's Keruso once again, but Jesus Christ as Lord. Now, there's reference here, analogs here, because the emperors are called lords repeatedly. And here's just a listing. I can't take the time to look at all of these, but the kurios is used repeatedly on inscriptions. I don't believe it's on coins, but also there's another analog in that Jesus is said to be the icon of God. Well, the ikones is, the first definition is the likeness or portrait of the emperor's head on a coin. And these are all over the place. This is the word that Jesus used, whose icon is on the coin, whose inscription. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time just considering the relevance here, but if Jesus is the icon of God, and then these icon are the ways that you describe the images on coins, obviously there's an analogy there. Moreover, icones are used in the mystery cults, the imperial mystery cults. And if you have never read the article by H.W. Pleckett, it is certainly worth a close read in this regard. I think over half of the New Testament references to icon have explicit reference to the imperial image. And we could debate that. But anyway, so this is an important analog. Now, I think the first reference, I'm going to look at 3 references, and I might do this rather quickly. I've got about 5, 6, 7 minutes, we'll see. But the God of this age, God of this world, I believe is a reference to Augustus. I've argued this at length, so I don't want to spend a lot of time going through that argument now. But what relevance would this mention of this God of this age is blinding the minds of unbelievers? Keener, in his commentary, and he's got an exhaustive mind, 27 file cabinets of notes, and he's a colleague of mine, great respect. But he says, Jewish interpreters did not refer to Satan this way. So for me, that's a clue to say, okay, well, what is this then? This had to have relevance for them. And so that's when I start to roll up my sleeves and do some work. So this God blinds the minds of people not to see. This is not blepo. This is avgase, which sounds like Augustus. And I don't think that that's accidental. And so what's happening here is that Augustus, the God Augustus, is so blinding in his prominence that he is a competitor, or Jesus is a competitor, vice versa. There's a lot of light imagery in this context. And here is just a little display of some of the contrast between the two. And I don't want to stop and look at this. You can find my essay. You can email me. I'd be glad to send it to you. So I think the God of this age is indeed a reference to Augustus, and the prominence of him, his statue divinized Jupiter looking, is evident in the Roman Corinth's forum. And here's the base, the Augustalis base, and it says, Divo Augusto, to the god Augustus. And here's a reconstruction of this image. She thinks he was partially draped, but with Jupiter's arrow standing there. On the other side, behind him, where he can't see, was a game board inscribed in the bench, which is kind of funny to think about. And so we have a lot of coinage that shows Augustus radiate, and this radiate indicates a divinized status. So here's these coins showing Divus Augustus everywhere. I think it was Michael Peppered, his dissertation under Harold Attridge, the Son of God. He says there were anywhere from 25,000 to 50,000 physical statue images of Augustus, which amounts to like one church. Like for every church in the United States, there would be an image of Augustus. Now that does not include coins. So that obviously would be a lot more than that. Now Beliar. What's the deal with Beliar? And of course, this is one of the red flag for this passage of 2 Corinthians. This can't be written by Paul. What does this mean? Certainly looks like Qumran. Well, the thing is, the war scroll, what is the war scroll about? The Kittim and their leader, Beliar. Well, the Kittim are the Romans. This has been interpreted as the Romans. Their leader would be then the Roman emperor. And so notice that Beliar is contrasted with the Messiah. And so I have some references here to the Sibylline oracles, other documents. One of my Ascension of Isaiah is really clear about this. Someone who killed his mother, I believe it says. Murder of his mother, which is Nero. Now, one of my students, he actually is an Old Testament student. He's now Dr. Pavo Tucker. But out of my seminar, he wrote and developed this research. And so I want to stop and just give you a shout out to him, who ran with my initial ideas and developed that out. A fascinating study showing the convergence of Beliar language with political rule. And so this leads us then to the last imperial referent, which, out of the blue somewhat, Paul says, in comparison, there's false apostles, deceitful workers, who disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. No wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Again, I wonder, how would this manifested to the Corinthians? What would come to their mind? What would be such a bright figure that they would be attracted to, particularly in the context of Roman Corinth? Well, commentators will find explanation in intertestamental literature. After reviewing these options, Murray Harris, in his very fine commentary, considers the possibility that the expression, quote, may be a Pauline coinage, no pun intended, based on the earlier discussion, which we've been looking at, Beliar, and 4:4-6. So he's linking this back. This has to be related. Well, if these texts have imperial reference, what does that mean? Well, the reference is easily supplied. Ubiquitous in the Mediterranean world was understanding rulers as suns or stars. The evidence and development for such an understanding is extensively provided by Stefan Weinstock in his Divus Iulius. J. Rufus Fear summarizes the broad extent of the evidence. Comparison of the living ruler with the sun was a well-known theme in Hellenistic panegyric, and by the time of Augustus it was so hackneyed that Horace demurred to use it. Nonetheless, the comparison and assimilation of the emperor to the sun remained an important motive of imperial encomia. The celebration of the ruler as Sidus and light-bearer to the world was a frequent topos of imperial panegyric. And so, well, here we have a Rhodian coin depicting Helios, crowned radiate. And so this is where the radiate crowns start to come in to play and merging with the emperors. And so there's kind of an interesting development here, because this was done with deceased emperors. But something happens with Nero. And there's also a debate, when does Nero adopt the Apollo soul? When does the solar monarchy theme get developed in Nero? Is it at the start of his reign or later reign? And Marianne Berman says it's propagated right at the start. So 54, Nero is associated with soul, with sun and brightness and radiantness. And this is seen in Seneca's Apocolosyntosis, or the pumpification of Claudius. So Phoebus is speaking, the bright one, and he says this: like the morning star Lucifer, as he rises, scattering the stars in flight, or like the evening stars as he rises, like the gleaming sun, as soon as the rosy dawn has dispelled the shadows and led the day, as he gazes on the world, soul, and begins to whip up his chariot from the starting barrier, such a Caesar is at hand. So he writes this at the end of Claudius's life. Nero is such a Caesar, radiant, face blazes with gentle brilliance. And so we have, in fact, at the start of his reign, he's got this sun or star over him. And then while he is alive, he is depicted as radiate. And there is some debate whether Caligula is depicted as radiate or not. It's debated. But certainly with Nero, it is. And so he is here radiate. And so, one other point is that Augustus often identified himself as a messenger of the gods. So who is this disguised figure that Satan takes the form of? I think it's probably Nero, but perhaps it's Augustus. But in conclusion, imperial devotion and the cult had hit the fan in Corinth, right as he preached the gospel there and wrote to the Corinthians. Based on Paul's rhetoric, we discern his need to defend his intentions to return to Corinth. He's part of a triumphal march. And one of my students, John Enzer, just as newly published his research where he tracks an exiled political figure. One of the topos that can be used is this metaphor of triumph. And so I think John lays that out brilliantly. And at the same time, Paul is able to use this theme to address and confront the Corinthians' idolatrous and sinful temptation and involvements with unbelievers, Belial, Nero, and the god of this age, Augustus, either of whom could be Satan disguised as an angel of light. Thank you.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.